Great. Well, thank you for joining us this evening. This is now the fourth in our series on 21st century survival skills. And I'm delighted to be picking this topic up that actually we left our very first edition on this tricky balance around liberty and security and technology. You may recall the first session we did with Carissa Belith and with Zaid Rada Hussein, the former UN Commissioner on Human Rights, and Mike Waldridge, who's the head of the computer science department here at Oxford. We were looking at how do you protect your privacy online? And there was so much interest in that we decided to do a deeper dive with two of the planet's greatest experts on cybersecurity and the protection of not just our data as individuals, but as nations, to really help us understand this area, which is moving so fast, and yet will be very much part of our lives in the future. Welcome on behalf of Hertford College. I'm Tom Fletcher, the principal, and we're looking forward to doing these sessions in the not too distant future in real life again, back in Cat Street, once we're on the other side of this pandemic. But for now, welcome to an online session. We've got two great guests, Kieran Martin and Noran Fouad, who are going to lead us in this conversation today. Kieran, many of you will know from the Hertford community, an academic visitor here at Hertford, but also based at Blavatnik, as is Dr. Noran. Kieran is actually a great example of how you can end up doing just about anything with a Hertford education and a bit of bluff. Kieran is actually a historian and has somehow, after, let's say, 20 plus years doing various meanders around government, working on constitutional issues, political issues, working in Downing Street, working in many different departments, has somehow found himself on the cusp of one of the key issues of the age, moving from looking at these cybersecurity issues, working with GCHQ and other government departments, into actually setting up the UK's first cybersecurity centre, government centre, really the front line protecting UK infrastructure from cyber attack. So we're delighted to have Kieran with us at Hertford College, but particularly tonight with us here. Dr. Noran is a postdoc researcher at Blavatnik, focused on cybersecurity, most recently at the University of Cairo and elsewhere, and at Sussex, of course, as well. So we've got real academic and practical heft tonight. Right, so let's just pitch in. As always, do send us in your questions. I'll endeavour to answer any questions we get, but there'll also be chance afterwards on Twitter to ask any questions that we don't get to. So let's get going. Let me start with Dr. Noran. So why does this matter? You know, to the average student or member of the alumni watching from home at the moment, you know, they probably think that this is an area for sort of Star Wars-y, and it's an area for cyber geeks fighting each other in cyberspace. Doesn't really have much to do with our daily lives. But so why should we care about cyber defense?
Yeah, thank you so much, Tom, firstly, for having me. And this is such an important topic. I think that's the problem, that so many people think that cybersecurity is something of state power politics and something that we hear about in the news, but I shouldn't worry about it that much. And recently, you would see that some people have started to become a bit aware about privacy concerns. So what kind of data the several tech industries, for instance, are collecting about them, but you wouldn't find the same kind of awareness in cybersecurity. So the same kind of person who would have maybe took a decision to leave WhatsApp recently and go to Signal because of privacy concerns, they might be the same person who haven't updated their computers or their mobile phones for a very long time, or have been using the same kind of password in different devices and different accounts. So that's actually a very important topic. And I think the more that we're digitalizing, the more we should think about cybersecurity. So the use of digital technologies goes hand in hand with cybersecurity. The more dependent you are on technology and the more you use it, the more automatically vulnerable you will become, because it's like you're increasing the channels through which you could be targeted by a hacker, by a state actor, or even by cyber criminals, etc. So when you take a decision as an individual or as an organization that you're going to depend more on digital technologies, you should actually be thinking simultaneously about cybersecurity. Because on the long run, I mean, if you have if I decided, for instance, I want to be living in a smart house as an individual, and I don't think about my cybersecurity, it's not going to take long until I actually face quite a big problem, and it would be, in that case, a bit late. So as the session titled is how not to lose your data. How not to lose your data is actually to think about cybersecurity early on, and to be aware also not just about the kind of measures that you would take as an individual to secure yourself, but also to be aware about how state power politics, the things that we hear about in the news, how would it affect my security as an individual user? Would it actually have an implication? Is it something that I shouldn't know about? The tech industries, for instance, and the kind of practices that software vendors, for instance, have in the market. Does this affect my security? Of course it does, because one important and interesting thing about cyberspace is that it's very complex and interdependent. So my security is dependent on everybody's security as well, and vice versa. So it's not something that we should think about in just as a personal decision. It's not just a personal matter, and it's not a state matter. It's everybody's business, actually.
So I want to come back to some of these points about where that individual security meets the geopolitical context. But first, I mean, Kieran, so Noran has described, that anyone who has a certain exposure to technology is vulnerable. And I guess anyone who's joining us on this call or watching on YouTube probably heard about it they subscribe by email. They may have heard about it over Twitter, and now they're watching it on YouTube or on Zoom. But Kieran, I mean, never mind governments for now, and those you were defending out there at the cyber security department. What should we be doing, yesterday as individuals to be protecting our data online?
So it depends who you are and what you want to achieve and what sort of risk you want to manage. So sometimes harm can happen and it's just not your fault. There's a great guy, an Australian called Troy Hunt, and he runs a website called haveibeenpwned.com. Pwned is P-W-N-E-D, technical term for basically done over in cyberspace. And basically what he does is he gets all the data from declared hacks of customer data, and he just puts it all together and you can search it. And if you want a sense of the scale, and this is just one person doing it for a hobby. I mean, he runs a business on the back of it, but you can search it for free. He's picked up 10.6 billion email account breaches. I'm on it because I've searched it because I was on LinkedIn in 2012. I don't know if you were, Tom, but you might well have been. And LinkedIn was completely done over in 2012. That's not my fault. I joined LinkedIn in good faith, and it's on there, and it says what the password was at the time and all the rest of it. So that's not my fault. I'll come to the harm it does in a moment. What would have been my fault was when everybody had to relog back into LinkedIn, and LinkedIn's amazingly clever first solution was please to verify your identity, send a scanned photograph of your passport over so that we can verify it's you. And obviously that didn't go down very well with the cybersecurity industry given what it was responding to. What is that? So for people of your and my vintage, Tom, you can go back to the Sandra Bullock film, The Net, in the 1990s, where she gets completely, her everything is lost. She disappears off the face of the planet. That is, of course, highly rare. If you lose your data, I mean, that's all possible. Most things are possible in this day and age, but it's very, very rare. And actually, Noran set out some of the sort of things that can happen. But by and large, if you lose some of your data directly, not a great deal will happen to you. If you lose, let's say, so I think I've lost my data through LinkedIn. I've lost it through Ticketmaster. I bought some concert tickets a few years ago. It was done over. Ticketmaster was actually not a terribly serious breach because it was just my email, last 4 digits of a bank card. Not much you can do with that. You sell it on to the so-called dark web. It becomes part of a criminal ecosystem, and it does a wider societal harm because then you can do brute force attacks. You can log in. You can do all sorts of things. You can just basically try and overpower machines with logins and passwords that you've nicked and all the rest of it. So, there's a huge sort of, it's like the sort of, I know because I'm a great admirer of her work, but I know Carissa, in her work on privacy sort of, comes close to likening some of the legitimate companies to sort of, data criminals. But this is sort of actually the genuinely criminal side of the same thing. There's this huge ecosystem of stolen data, and you're contributing to that. And then, in the wash, some of the harm will come back to you individually or as part of a member of society. So it may come back to you because it's easier to skim your bank account, that risk will be heightened if your own personal security is weak. But it will come back to you in terms of things like higher prices, lower public confidence in technology, etc., and strategic weaknesses. So sometimes it's a bit like not being a litter lout. There's this actual social responsibility thing to looking after your data. I haven't answered your question, what should you do about it? There's sort of, I would say, 3 levels. So there's a basic tech level where you should do probably 3 things. One is update your device. Those up, every time, sometimes less so now because people tend to understand it. But when I was teaching very basic cybersecurity in the past, I said, that thing that says update available, you know what that actually means? It means this thing is connected to everything else in the world and someone's found a really bad flaw in it. And they're telling you to fix it. They're not trying to annoy you. That's what they're saying. So update. Secondly, that sort of annoying thing, 2-factor authentication that the whole university is doing. That's the difference between some of the Troy Hunt stuff being really easy to use and much harder to use. So for example, in a apparently Iranian state-backed attack on the UK Parliament in 2017. Multi-factor authentication saved some of the harm because they did a brute force attack, took loads of emails, loads of passwords, tried to force it through. Those accounts with multi-factor authentication, you can't do it. Those without multi-factor, you can quite easily. And then the third thing is backups. An awful lot of this is about, you're much more vulnerable if you can have your data taken away from you. Now, it's not great to lose your data, but there's a difference between losing a copy of it and losing your data. So those are the 3 sort of technical things. There's then a sort of basic responsibility, and this rises then with, frankly, who you are and what you want to achieve. So you and I used to work in government, so that's not the only sensitive area. Of course, people in businesses and NGOs have lots of sensitive stuff, but just for sake of ease of argument, because you and I will understand government. I remember the best way I learned this was in 2009, post-crash, when we had the G20. I think you were in Downing Street at the time. First time we really saw massive global digital espionage in the UK because it was hosting the summit designed to sort of shore up the world system. And there was one attack that got through, and we were kind of figuring out, but this is on quite a junior Foreign Office official. How did they figure out who this person was? Then we saw someone said, if you check Twitter handle, I'm working on preparations for the G20 summit in London. That's who they figured out who it was. And then, of course, there's a whole new level of if you're in a genuinely sensitive position, if you have some really, really interesting research, if you're carrying a state secret, if you're a dissident in a country with an oppressive government, you just have to be a lot smarter, and there's a personal risk balance to that. And then you get into, very powerful but quite inconvenient and sometimes misused tools like, very, very powerful encryption, the onion router, and so forth. But you are more careful because you have more to lose. So there's a sort of sliding scale of things, but everybody should be doing patching, 2-factor authentication, and backups.
And so the fact that my LinkedIn was hacked in 2012 shouldn't worry me because someone might play around with my A-level results or my, where I did my first work experience placement, but because it's part of that much bigger, I'm just a piece of hay in this haystack. So
there are 2 reasons. So one is, there's the piece of hay in this haystack, and that is something to worry about. For you, though, you used to hold a senior position in government. You're head of a college at a prestigious university. So there may be things that are of interest. So, if your password's on it, and on LinkedIn it probably is, if you have repeatedly, that's why the reuse of password advice comes in. However, one of the problems with cybersecurity, and Noran touched on this, is that we've made it ridiculously hard for people to use. So password policy was one of these producer capture things. We made it. So we did some work when I was in government in the National Cybersecurity Centre. We got a behavioural scientist, this wonderful German professor from UCL called Professor Angela Sassa. And we said to her, can you model for us what it takes to obey government guidance on passwords? And basically, password guidance was, let's say I own a network and you want on it. I set rules that are convenient for my network, so they're quite hard for you to get on, complicated password. I'm going to make you change it every month. But you have 25 such accounts in your weekly life. And Professor Sassa, she computed that in order to follow this, it was the equivalent of requiring people to learn a new 600-digit number every month. So it was literally asking people to do the impossible, which is why people keep forgetting passwords and getting locked out. And that's where password managers come along, and that's where multi-factor authentication come along, where things save it for you. You have one sort of password that you keep that you can remember, et cetera, et cetera. Because basically the problem for someone like you're a good example of this, where, somebody in a nation state might think, that Fletcher, he's quite interesting, let's see with him. You have a look at his LinkedIn and say, all right, let's see if he's stupid enough to use the same password for every account in his life, including his Foreign Office work account or his number 10 work account or his Hartford College account. And he doesn't have multi-factor authentication, in which case if that happened, they're in.
Right, I better dash off and change that West Ham Forever 123 password across all my devices. It's not that, by the way, Vladimir Putin, if you're listening in at the moment. Well, actually, that brings me to the bad guys then, Noran. Is it governments we should be worried about here? And I used to assume when I was in government, certainly in Downing Street with Kieran, that there maybe were 7 or 8 governments routinely tapping my phone. Are they the people that we should be worried about now? Or who are the bad guys out there?
I think
for Noran.
I quite like what Kieran just said, that it depends on who you are. So the bad guys for you can be quite different from the bad guys for another person. So for instance, many people who work in human rights defenders, for instance, and members of the civil society organizations, these people are increasingly targeted now by nation states who actually might have cybersecurity laws and regulations and strategies where in fact it's all the government efforts is going into buying spyware. If they don't have the technology themselves, they buy spyware from institutions like the NSO Group, for instance, which is quite known now for being a cyber warfare company as per they define themselves, and they sell these kind of software to governments, and they use it in order to target journalists and civil society organizations. So yes, from that perspective, for these kind of people, for activists, for people who can be targeted by governments within authoritarian regimes, this is a huge threat. And this is one of the threats actually that are not often talked about, because again, if these kind of states are defining cybersecurity as a national security issue, and for them national security is protecting the security of the state, that's a huge problem. So we should always ask, security for whom? And it's the same. I mean, it's not necessarily just governments and authoritarian regimes. So for instance, now in lots of countries, including the US, for instance, and the UK and several other Western governments, one strategy that states define as defensive strategies is actually, and sometimes they call it defend forward or active cyber defense. And it's all about finding a vulnerability in software that not just their rivalries are using, like government entities, but also other entities within the state and elsewhere. And they actually, instead of going to the private sector and telling them, okay, we found this vulnerability or this error in coding in your software, please fix it for the security of everyone, they actually stockpile those vulnerabilities in order to use it for their own purposes, whether offensive/defensive. But then again, I mean, it really blurs the line between offense and defense, because when is it offense and when is it defense? So we've all heard recently about the SolarWinds cyber espionage campaign that Russia, it has been attributed to Russia somehow. And now the US politicians and policymakers are talking about it as an attack. And it's actually the exact same practices that the US is doing all the time. And it has been setting the precedent for this for so many years, and maybe encouraging these kind of practices from its rivalries. So these kind of things, actually, it might seem like it's a battlefield. So this is Russia versus the United States of America, and us as individual users are not affected. But that's not the case, because cyberspace is quite different. And the analogies of the military warfare, this doesn't work in the space because it's very much interconnected. And the span of the uncontrollable is also quite big. So yes, of course, a state can launch a very carefully targeted attack or espionage campaign against its rivalries. But again, the unintended consequences can be quite big. And therefore, this kind of attack can actually spread to a huge number of individual users and citizens elsewhere, even inside the state that has launched this particular attack against others. And there's so many examples for how this has already happened before. So this actually raises a big question about what kind of practices are we legitimizing here? Are we normalizing this kind of attacks or practices just because it's done by the good guys? I mean, if it's the United States of America, it's fine, but if it's Russia, that's not the case. Or are we actually, do we care about the security of this technology in general and our trust in the technology? Because these kind of practices are not just affecting our security, but it's undermining the trust in the technology everywhere. And it's quite connected. As I said in the beginning, it's a very interdependent, like the level of interdependence in cyberspace is quite big. But also, if you move to private sector and companies and tech industries, there is a huge problem as well. I mean, cybersecurity is as much an economic issue as it is a technical security issue or political, etc. So the modes of competition in the market now, so many private industries and software vendors, they rush into introducing products into the market because they want to create bigger profits, they want to fare better in the competition, but then they know that these software have certain vulnerabilities, but then let's get it in the market, let's fix those vulnerabilities later at a later stage. But then the security of us as individual users is affected. And they actually use the idea that as individual citizens and users also of technology, we do not have the technical knowledge that would allow us to distinguish between a secure device or a software or a piece of technology and an unsecure one. So this whole mode of production actually made the culture of software insecurity quite acceptable and normalized. I'm not suggesting that you can have 100% secure software. That's not possible, and there will always be another error in every software. But still, I mean, the amount of time and money and budgets and everything that is going into the design of this technology could be much better and for the security of everyone. And at the end of the day, you wouldn't be able to hold them liable for that. I'm not gonna go and file a case against a certain software vendor just because my account got hacked because of a vulnerability in their system. It doesn't work like this. And many private industries and tech industries have been actually fighting the idea of liability and saying that this is gonna harm innovation. It is not an easy answer. There's no easy answer for such a complicated issue. It's not like, yes, let's hold them all liable, because at the end of the day, again, the span of the uncontrolled and the uncontrollable is quite big, even for private sector. But there should be a balance here. It shouldn't be just completely and also, I mean, you might have some regulations in certain countries, but that's not the case elsewhere. So yeah, you have the GDPR, for instance, and institutions now are obliged to say and disclose if their accounts have been breached or their system have been breached, so you would know if your data has been breached by that has been stored in a different entity. But that's not the case everywhere. So that's why I think there's no good / bad guys out there. It just depends on who you are and what kind of practices and what kind of rules and regulations also in the context where you live.
So I want to put that challenge to Kieran, who presumably thought that he was one of the good guys in his last job, and that his successor now is one of the good guys. But just before that, can I so when I get the email from Chrome that says you have 13 passwords compromised, you need to go and change them now, you know, because of my lack of trust in the overall system, I instantly think, is this actually a phishing attack in itself. Is there any practical advice you can give me and others at that point for understanding what is a genuine warning as opposed to, one more phishing attack?
Yeah, so there's a bit of so there is a sort of rule of thumb about realism and too good to be true. So let me some attacks are really sophisticated. The good thing about sophisticated attacks is they're very hard to scale. So I'll start with sort of mass market spray attacks. Sometimes they're called in in government cybersecurity agencies or in the cybersecurity industry, because you just formulate something and just push it out to as many emails as you can find and see who clicks on it. So a lot of this stuff comes from, if you're in the UK, a lot of this will come from outside European and North American jurisdictions, because we've got law enforcement arrangements with them, quite good police forces. So it's a pretty stupid place to set up a massive international cybercrime syndicate, because chances are the law enforcement will come and find you. So during the pandemic, so criminals are a huge part of this ecosystem. Noran touched on that. During the pandemic, when the fear started about various COVID things, criminals immediately moved to do scams. So I remember showing a scam on TV, which was something I'd got. I remember there were three things that were that should have been warning signs. So firstly, it was pretending to be from HMRC, the British Tax Authority, and if you hovered over the URL, if you hovered over the click in the link and you looked at it, it looked like it was, the logos were all fine and the font was the right size for gov.uk and that sort of thing. But if you hovered over the URL, it was ludicrous. The site that came up was just absolute gobbledygook. So that's one thing. But you don't want to have to hovering over emails. There was another thing though, which was it said GBP £386. You're going to get a government help of GBP £386. Now again, if you've lived for a while in Britain and dealt with the government never uses GBP. It uses the pound sign. But probably, these people in some country thousands of miles away didn't have keyboards with a pound sign on it, so they wrote GBP. But the third thing was, and this is the obvious point, there was nobody really missed the news about the coronavirus, and it was kind of a big deal. If you haven't heard that there's a government scheme that's going to give you nearly £400 in cash, then there probably isn't one, so you probably shouldn't click on it. So that's at the sort of absurd end of it. Your Google Chrome thing is a really interesting point, because here's a story. It's a real story with profoundly important consequences, and it's open to two interpretations. So it's about a close aide of Hillary Clinton's. So during the Russian hack of the Democrats' campaign in 2016, they did two hacks. One was of the Democratic National Committee server. So they just did a classic attack on a corporate network. I mean, the DNC is an important organization, but it's not a very big one. So it didn't have great IT security. So they just basically took the server, loads of emails on it. But they also hacked the Gmail of one of Secretary Clinton's closest aides. And the way they did it, and this is all in the public domain, the way they did it was essentially they mocked up being Google, Gmail, and they sent him a message. It was really, really clever and smart, saying, look, we need you to turn off your two-factor authentication for maintenance and all the rest of it, etc. So he did, because it looked the part. Now, on the one hand, you can say that was deeply unfortunate, and I'm sympathetic because it looked so good. And that's one of the reasons why that sort of thing doesn't scale. Some people, a team of people, worked really hard on this. So they're not going to do it to 1 million people. They don't have the resources. We sometimes glorify, hackers as if they're omnipotent. We'll come to that in a minute. But we glorify them. So they did this attack and he fell for it. And I would be very sympathetic, busy person, not, primary job isn't cybersecurity, looked the part, and had already got the sort of proper protections on. The critical way of looking at it was, if you're driving on a motorway and you see a sign and it's the right size, it's the right font, it looks like a British Highways Agency sign, or in the US or wherever you are, it looks like the authentic road sign, but it actually says, close your eyes, lie back and put your foot to the floor, you probably wouldn't do it. And essentially, that's what they were asking him to do. If you got a letter from the police that looked authentic saying, from now on, it's good practice to leave your front door open, you probably you'd probably conclude that was. So do you see what I mean? You know, and that's a little bit about the education process in this. So, but the basic rule of thumb is, you know, or two rules of thumb. One, if it's too good to be true or vaguely implausible, then it probably is. You know, and if you haven't heard about it, and secondly, you know, if in doubt, just don't do it. It's not that big a deal.
And then, okay, because I've got a question here actually on James, from James, one of our alumni, on a very specific hack that he suffered from, and actually it's a very familiar one. I think I have two relatives who've fallen for this one too. The email you get that says, "I'm backpacking in Nepal. I've run out of money. Can you just kind of wire me $200 so I can pay for my hostel tonight?" And what he's saying is that, do you ever bring these guys to justice? Do you ever, are you able as a cyber center to track them down? You know, and if not, what are you doing?
So I can, so this involves me answering the bad guys question, if that's all right, Tom. And so, right, where I agree with Noran is the fundamental problem is weak technology. I mean, that's the basic problem that we've got. You know, technology is insecure, and so loads of different people are going to exploit it. But, you know, if you're in a job of a National Cybersecurity Centre, then you do have to worry about bad guys, and there are gradations. So cyber criminals are absolutely, you know, they're all over the place, and actually people on this call, you know, students, academics and so forth, for the most part have to worry about that, people who are after money, and so on. The problem for a country like this is that, as I say, most of it is a non-friendly, or not unfriendly, but jurisdictions where there's not a law enforcement treaty. So an awful lot of cybercrime that afflicts the UK comes from the Russian borderlands, different from the Russian state. There's a sort of slightly Faustian pact between the Russian state and organised cyber criminals, which is if they leave Russians alone, they tend not to get bothered by the Russian authorities, but that's not the same thing as saying it's directed from Russia. But Russians don't extradite anybody. So, you know, there are only certain things you can do, and it's a sad reality. So you do toughen up your defenses, because a lot of this it's well organized, but it's very unsophisticated. So loads of the stuff that you can do through automatic blocking, and I can come to that later, but I won't now. You know, the National Cybersecurity Centre did loads of this sort of really pioneering stuff on how to do automatic blocking of criminal attacks. You actually do, and this is very much in the news. I'm sometimes skeptical about the use of offensive cyber, but against criminals, organized criminals, it can be quite effective, because basically, if you can safely basically destroy their networks, then they can't use them, and sometimes that's your only option in this sort of thing. And then occasionally for the big ones, you know, then. And this is a real example, but I'm afraid it doesn't happen very often. You know, but a real example, one of Russia's top cyber criminals decides that he's going to go on holiday for Cyprus for a week, and, you know, 3 days in, he's now awaiting extradition for a very long stretch somewhere in the United States, you know, and that sort of thing happens from time to time, but it's a really difficult problem. Cybercrime in many ways is conceptually and operationally very similar to other crime, except for the first time in human history, in my judgment anyway, it's possible to have large-scale harm inflicted in a very distant land without ever setting foot in it, or any of your allies setting foot. You know, basically, if you're going to commit a physical act of harm, plant a bomb, do a shooting, rob a bank, eventually you or somebody working with you has to actually go and have a physical presence there. You don't have to. So cybercrime is endemic. The other thing that I would just say, to add to to build on what Noran said, is that you know, myths and realism really matter when you're talking about who you think the bad guys are. So, you know, there used to be, thankfully we've moved on from this, you know, comparisons in terms of states with, you know, is it like the nuclear deterrent or something like that? It's completely different. So anybody could be a little bit cyber. So one of the most serious attacks I dealt with in terms of public confidence in the UK was the TalkTalk telephone company in 2015. Now, it turned out the TalkTalk telephone company was, the hack there was perpetrated by a 15-year-old using a 17-year-old exploit, which is called a SQL injection, which basically is, you know, when you're filling in a form on a drop-down menu and stuff like that, instead of filling in, you know, your name or address, whatever, you fill in some commands. It goes looking for things. It's really easy to defend against. TalkTalk hadn't defended against, but I got taught that technique in 20 minutes. the person who did that could not, bring down a TV station, can't take out a power supply, and so forth. Those are so anybody can be a little bit of a cyber menace. The really, really lethal stuff is very, very hard, and only a small number of nation states can do it. Very interesting example of that is that the major prescribed terrorist organizations have very limited cyber capability, because it's very hard to develop that if you're trying to avoid detection. So, for example, if you're a prescribed organization that the US doesn't like, and the US and its allies are chasing you all over the world, then the last thing you want to be doing is build a sophisticated digital system pinging to the internet all the time, because that basically tells you where it is, right? So one of the things that's actually, thankfully, I know I'm going all over the place, cyber criminals are a really hard problem, but one of the things that saves us, if you like, from really escalatory cyber sort of proper attacks, cuts to power supplies and things like that, is that that's really quite hard to do. And the only people that can do it, even if they're malevolent, tend to be quite rational. And they're no more likely deliberately to cut off a power supply to a hospital than they are to, bomb the hospital in the first place. So, there's just some food for thought there about who the sort of bad people are and aren't.
So I want to talk, actually, I want to ask Noran about the Middle East context for all this. But just before leaving Kieran, we haven't yet pinned him down. We've heard a lot about the bad guys, but on who the good guys are, really. And, a skeptic might say, Kieran, that, you were on the board of GCHQ, Government Communication Headquarters, whose job, I think it's fair to say most people would understand as being in the spying business.
Yeah,
and does involve looking at huge amounts of data in order to find patterns, etc., etc. So, so you're sort of, were you poacher turned gamekeeper? You're like a kind of one of the guys who can break into safes, who then gets told to come and actually defend the bank.
So it's a really interesting question, and I think the way I would bring it to life. No one's already talked about the vulnerabilities. I mean, so I came to GCHQ, the British sort of digital spying agency, just after the Snowden leaks, and so my first year was just dominated by this sort of controversy. And there's a guy, a Cambridge professor of maths, I've got a huge amount of respect for, Professor Ross Anderson, who characterized this, I think, slightly unfairly, but just to illustrate the point, he said that, if there was, he said more or less something like this, if there was a flaw in technology that allowed you to get at Putin, GCHQ would happily leave 66 million Britons open to the same exploitation just to get at Putin. First of all, that exact characterization, and maybe it's unfair because I'm not sure he used that exact one, it doesn't survive contact with the real world, and that, Putin will not be using that sort of technology that for anything useful anyway, that gives rise to that. And secondly, if that were the case, whilst it's hard for me to talk about this, but I'm pretty confident certainly the GCHQ I left in 2020 would have said, well, we've got to patch that vulnerability. There's no possible intelligence gain from getting at Putin that is worth leaving every person, man, woman and child in the UK and millions of allies all over the world vulnerable to the same thing. But it's a good way of illustrating Noran's dilemma. I also think, since I'm free to speak my mind now, and I'm not always in agreement and with my former colleagues on things like defensive primacy. Basically I'm with Noran that the fundamental thing, put it this way, and I've said this before, the GCHQ I joined, I think if you said to them, are you in favor of safer technology? I think the GCHQ I joined would have really struggled to understand the question being put in that way. Its job was, and this is the sort of, this was a big Snowden debate, its job was to just, get the data. Now, of course, unlike non-rule of law countries and more authoritarian countries, there's very strict controls on what we could do and so forth. But fundamentally, there was this genuine issue about attitudinally, were you in favor of safe technology, or were there too many national security gains to be got by exploiting its weaknesses? And there have been plenty of people who either wouldn't have understood the question or would have actually said, I'm not sure, or maybe I'm not. I think the GCHQ I left, having set up a National Cybersecurity Centre, was fundamentally committed, and I hope it remains that way, to safer technology. Now, technology, as Noran said, will never be totally safe. And if, so there is a formal thing which we've now declared how it works, called the equities process for precisely these things. And these are sort of anonymized hypothetical examples. So I've given you the one extreme, Putin is up for grabs, but everybody else will be vulnerable. There are other extremes, and I know these are evocative, so people sometimes don't like you using them, but I can't think of a better example. There are some specialist vulnerabilities in technology that are essentially only used by serious international child sexual exploitation rings. So if you find out about those, are you going to go and tell the manufacturers, oh, we found a flaw, or are you going to say, right, GCHQ, National Crime Agency, FBI, can we put this in a very compartmented secret and work to avoid this horror? So it's not always clear cut. Where, and then there's this debate, so therefore should a cybersecurity centre be part of an agency like GCHQ? There is a skills thing in that the people who understand how to break this stuff, so the people who find those flaws that can help you catch pedophiles can also then, if they're more generally applicable, can help you patch them. Whereas, in other countries, France and Germany have a different model where, the intelligence and the cybersecurity are very, very different. And I think they struggle to bring that together a bit. So there's no perfect answer. I think we've moved in the right direction, and in terms of balancing the debate. And I don't think we should be shy of it. So, for example, I take no objection to being asked what you've just asked me. I think it's a perfectly fair question, and I think that whilst we shouldn't and can't fix everything. Our presumption, basically, certainly for the country, a rich Western, highly digitized society like the UK will always benefit from safer technology than it will from exploiting insecure technology. So that's what we should default towards.
Yeah. I want to come back to Noran then, and so Kieran's described a world in which he wants us to believe in, and obviously with my former hat on, I would agree with much of that as well, that governments will take a more benign approach to protecting citizens in this space. But of course, from your time in Cairo, my time in the Middle East during the Arab Spring, many citizens in the region there would really struggle to believe that their governments had that interest at heart. Do you think citizens in the Middle East are maybe more vigilant, are more careful with their online presence than those in the West might be, because of that suspicion of more authoritarian governments?
That's a very interesting question. And I think yes and no. I mean, it depends on which citizens you're talking about and which class you're talking about. I mean, cybersecurity everywhere is part of a bigger picture about the structural, socio-political and economic conditions and challenges the country is facing. But particularly in the Middle East and any low and middle income country for that matter, I think it's quite difficult. Actually, it's in these contexts where you can see that security is actually expensive, and the idea of awareness about what cybersecurity is and how you should actually take care of your security also differs between classes and different segments in the society. So in many countries, you would find that in the poor segments of the society, for instance, governments have been caring so much about increasing access, giving everybody a device that everyone should get on the internet. But actually, they cannot afford, in many cases, to buy an antivirus software, for instance, or to buy a licensed software that they are using. So the idea of pirated software is quite huge in many countries. Many people use unlicensed software that has no connections whatsoever with the vendor, so they are not receiving updates. They can't actually get any sort of protection for the kind of software they're using. This is a huge problem, and you have a huge level of illiteracy in many countries. So people do not understand the security functions of the devices they're using. They can actually get a security warning of any sort that they don't understand. What does it mean? What should I do? And that's why many countries in the region are actually safe havens for cyber criminals. It's a perfect community, a perfect context where they can actually as Kieran was saying, you don't need to be a sophisticated hacker or criminal to actually be able to crack these kind of devices or systems. It's quite easy actually, and this is the main problem, because you don't have cyber crime laws, and when you have it, you're not enforcing it. And as I was saying in the beginning, many governments actually are putting so much time and effort and budgets into buying spyware in order to track journalists and human rights activists and protesters, and it's quite actually a complicated and protracted complex situation, and you wouldn't be able as a citizen. I mean, I know many people who don't trust the technology. They like, sometimes I talk to people actually, and they're like, don't speak about the government because we don't know who's listening to us. I mean, people are quite scared, and sometimes they do not trust the government and do not trust the technology, but it doesn't mean that they are aware what kind of very simple practices that they can actually do in order to protect themselves. And sometimes also because, I mean, people have been imprisoned and killed because of these kind of practices that the government are doing actually. So it's not just a matter of, okay, let's use the technology and take all the precautions that we can take and carry on. It's actually quite it could be a life and death kind of situation in some cases. And I think it's also not just in Middle East, or this is elsewhere. The aspect of gender plays a very important role. And I mean, if you're talking about a patriarchal society, for instance, women are much more threatened in cyberspace than men, and they could be blackmailed because of their data and their photos way more than men, also through very simple kind of hacks. It's not, you do not have to be a sophisticated hacker to actually get into somebody's phone if they don't have the capacity, as I'm saying, to protect themselves. So they will be affected more. The LGBT community as well, they are way more threatened. So it's not easy in these kind of contexts to actually just simplify everything and say, it's fine, I will take care and that's it. Even if you take care, your data, we know now that our data is not just in our phones, on our devices, it's in several places online. And even if you take all the precautionary measures and you do everything right, if your data gets leaked because another public institution or private institution or a tech company got hacked or breached, you're going to be affected, but who you are will matter very much. It's not just that we're all affected the same. It depends which class, which gender. It's quite complicated.
So I'm going to put Kieran on notice. There's a Huawei question coming his way in just a moment. But just in the meantime, just to pick up on that point, because in the social media space in the Middle East, which is a particular interest of mine over several years now, actually there's the bad guys are very sophisticated. You look at the way that Daesh were using, YouTube videos, etc., very effectively, sort of box office barbarity, really. Or you look at the way that the supporters of the Syrian regime or the Iranian regime, actually recently, even today, I've just been trolled by a bunch of them, have been quite effective at using trolling in that way. But is Kieran right that we don't yet have to fear this sort of horrific vision of a really nasty terrorist group that can also do cyber?
I think we shouldn't fear this. I quite agree with Kieran that the thing is with cybersecurity or cyber threats, they are quite different from what we normally envision as an existential kind of threat that would actually lead to catastrophic consequences. I think these small kind of data breaches are in themselves important, and the mundane in cyberspace, I think, is quite urgent. It doesn't have to be existential. It doesn't have to be a terrorist attack, because, I mean, this might get a bit philosophical, but the idea of violence in cyberspace is quite different as well. It's not as physical as we're used to. I mean, it's quite different from normal kind of or conventional kind of threats, and we should think about it this way. We should not be waiting for this catastrophic event happening in order to think that this is actually a critical matter. It is critical because it's mundane, and the incremental effects of this mundane on the long run could be quite catastrophic, actually, financially. It could affect people's privacy. It could, as we were saying, undermine our trust in the technology altogether. So we should not, I think, at the moment, I mean, we never know how things are going to evolve, and the technology is evolving every day. But I don't think we should be expecting or waiting for this big kind of incident, because I don't think that the nature of this field, as like, which is really very, it's somehow physical in some ways, but it's very much non-physical as well. And the idea of having like seeing something crashing, this is not going to happen, or at least in the scale that we're imagining right now.
So there's so many questions coming in, and I'm just going to pick out the nastiest one for Kieran, the one I think he would like least. This is from Simon Solstrom, who says, Sweden recently banned Huawei from participating in the building of Swedish 5G networks. Their competitor Ericsson even argued to allow Huawei to compete in the bidding process. Should Huawei be banned from building 5G in the EU? In fact, there's a follow-up. There's another Huawei question. Let me chuck this one in as well. Is there no way to check and ensure that Huawei doesn't put in some spyware? Most telephones have components produced in China today. Is 5G really any different? Anyway, Huawei.
So the Huawei question, to answer that, two things. One is, it dominated so much of the last 2 of my 6.5 years that I'm actually holding up. These are a pair of cufflinks, not from Huawei, because you always have to, obviously, they were given to me by my technical team, and they're made entirely out of Huawei chips, checked by GCHQ engineers. So there you are. In fact, I actually got a double present out of it, because at my leaving do, Sir Alex Younger, who was then head of MI6, was so sort of appalled by these that he ripped off his own MI6 cufflinks and gave them to me, and they're now with my 11-year-old daughter, who's obsessed with MI6. So, to answer that, I'm going to, having stalled for a minute, I'm actually going to pick up on what Noran said, because to answer the question about risk and Huawei and Chinese tech in general, really picks up from what she says about catastrophic risk. So here you go. For the last 30 years, various people, really senior and important and impressive people, US defense secretaries and so on, have been talking about cyber Pearl Harbors, cyber 9/11s and that sort of thing. And, there have been some really sophisticated, what you might call destructive attacks. So in 2015, the citizens of Kiev were about 250,000 of them were without light, street lights and so on, and power for about 6 hours. And in the Ukrainian winter, that's pretty bad. But it's pretty rare. And in fact, the closest we've come to a proven cyber fatality is so-called ransomware by criminals. When a woman in Germany was on her way to hospital, the hospital admissions system was crippled by this ransomware, where they sort of tried to extort money out of the hospital. She died, having been transferred to another hospital further away. But the way to think about this, and I will come on to Huawei in a sec, is, and again, these are real things that you have to model. When you war game things like critical infrastructure, and I was I dealt with this direct example. We looked at, for example, what if there was a hostile state attack on the train signaling system in a London commuter station. Okay, so however realistic or unrealistic it was what if a hostile state figures out a way to take out suddenly and without warning the train signaling system. So then the question becomes, and it wasn't for me to answer, it was for the Department of Transport and the safety regulators, what happens if the signaling goes? Is it A, do all the trains continue at full speed and collide into each other, causing mass fatalities? Or B, do all the trains stop, causing mass inconvenience? Because those are two completely different outcomes. They're both bad, but one is catastrophic and the other is just really annoying and disruptive and costly and so forth. Now, clearly, if we have designed a system where A happens, because these things can fail accidentally as well as deliberately, we're crazy and we haven't done our job properly. And that's one of the reasons, direct cyber attack in the literal sense of the word is really almost, it's not impossible. Killer robots, etc., but it's really quite hard. And that brings me on to Huawei and 5G. We had, in the UK thing, and we've only got a few minutes left, so I'm not going to take you through the whole tortuous UK thing, but there was a thing around, there were two alternative visions of 5G security. One was 5G is such an integrated bubble of risk that any one attack of any quality anywhere was an existential threat to the whole network. That to us was the equivalent of trains colliding into each other. So if you allowed the 5G network to be designed in such a way that, one Huawei base station, and if it was less dark, I could see a base station, an Ericsson one from here, that one base station serving one area could cause catastrophic national risk, then, the head of the National Cybersecurity Centre, which was me at the time, should be fired. You shouldn't allow a 5G network to be built that way. If you then, as the UK have eventually done for really complicated reasons that have done, basically the UK had Huawei in networks for nearly 20 years based on all sorts of inspections because it was possible to do it. The US's second round of sanctions on Huawei made that impossible. We couldn't vouch for its supply chain anymore in a way that we could trust because it was full of American technology that we understood how it worked, and the US basically cut that off. So that's why the UK ended up banning it. But now, and for those who are more interested, there's a really good, I can't believe I'm recommending this, there's a really good sober Science and Technology Committee of the House of Commons report from last week about what the challenge is now. So if all EU countries follow, the UK, obviously now outside the EU, or Sweden, or wherever, and ban Huawei, you're left with Nokia and Ericsson. Fine. Problem, and I think, a lot of countries will end up like this. If you think you've got a safe 5G network because you've kicked Huawei out of it, then you haven't been listening to me and Noran for the last hour. Firstly, all technological equipment can fail. It can fail accidentally, or it can be exploited by somebody, a hacker. Doesn't matter where they're from, it can be exploited. B, Nokia and Ericsson, they're good enough companies. They don't have perfect security records, both next door to Russia. And, my job and my 6.5 years were full of unwitting, and SolarWinds is a really good example of this, the huge Russian hack on America. SolarWinds, one of the major vectors, it's called Sunburst, but SolarWinds is the company that is one of the major sources of intrusion into the US. SolarWinds is based in Austin, Texas, one of my favorite happy liberal cities in the world. So it shows you that actually the flag of origin of the country is only part of the story, because the Russians, who have Russia has no Huawei, it has no technological capability of its own to speak of, but it managed to get a huge strategic hold in the US by hacking a company based in Texas, of all places, right? So, if you get rid of Huawei, you're getting rid of one risk, and you can debate technically to what extent having limited Huawei and represents a manageable risk. And some people said any Huawei was an unacceptable risk. I would have disputed that, but then the sanctions just made it impossible to do it viably. And if you then, and we are bifurcating in the internet, if you then take Huawei out of it, do not kid yourself that you fixed telecom security, because weirdly, the only proven, Chinese intrusion on telcos, state intrusion on telcos, is through an American company, and the only proven compromise of Huawei to damage its customers was done by the Americans. So there you go.
Now, we've only got a couple of moments left, and I've got 3 really good questions in. So I'm going to ask you for a sort of one line, a tweet response, each of you, for each of these questions. We'll do a kind of quick fire round. So let's go to Noran first. You experts on cyber, you presumably know a lot about the dark web. What keeps you awake at night, and what should keep us awake at night out there?
Generally about cybersecurity, you mean? Yeah, I would say that everything that has to do with human security on the internet, and how some governments are actually taking cybersecurity as an excuse to limit people's freedom online and what they can say and what they cannot say. This is, I think, a critical issue that we're not talking about if we keep on speaking about cybersecurity as a national security matter.
Kieran, what keeps you awake apart from the kids and the dog?
Ransomware. Such an avoidable problem, but public services, businesses are getting hammered by it all the time, and it really frustrates me that we're not better at tackling it.
Yeah. Here's a question from Sarah. She said, recently Matt Hancock, the health minister, has spoken of how watching Contagion has helped him work out how to respond to the pandemic. What film do cyber geeks watch? Yeah, I suppose, which is most accurate? Is it Black Mirror or what? Noran, what?
I think,
or do you just watch all of them and think, oh, it's so far off the truth?
Mr. Robot would be a really very good series, that just shows you how easy cyber hacks are actually, and how very, like as Kieran was saying, simple things like not having a strong password, or even in big companies, all what it takes is just one employee who's not careful in order to get into the company's network. So yeah, I think Mr. Robot is quite interesting. But I love Black Mirror too.
Kieran, Peppa Pig?
I once had a very good argument with the Canadian Defence Minister about War Games, the Matthew Broderick 1984 classic, where what it's got going for it is that the world is saved by guessing that the password is the name of the computer scientist's recently deceased son. What it hasn't got going for it is that Matthew Broderick almost starts a nuclear war by playing a video game, which is slightly beyond credulity. Actually, I haven't found a film. I have found a book, if I'm allowed a book, Tom. There's a book called The Cuckoo's Egg. It's 30 years old. It's by an American called Cliff Stoll. It's brilliant. He was doing a summer job to earn some money at Berkeley's computer lab in the days when like in Hartford and our day, Tom, where you had the computer room, and there was sort of it was time was allocated to money, and he noticed a 75-cent accounting error, and he just followed it because he was trying to reconcile the accounts. And it took him all the way to a Soviet Union. It was that long ago, a Soviet Union espionage campaign against the US military, which succeeded largely because of 3/4, I think, of the targets said login, guest, password.
Okay, one final one from one of our fellows, actually. Are there any leaders or politicians out there in the world who actually understand these threats? Have we got any technologically competent leaders? You can name one each.
We have one with us. I would say Kieran.
I'm thinking more at a sort of level of sort of heads of government, or maybe even heads of state.
That's a tough one.
Can you think of anyone that would really understand these challenges to our collective security?
So, I'm conscious one of the reasons why it's always good to have Noran sort of more global perspective. I'm sort of terribly Western given what I used to do. But Justin Trudeau, there's a brilliant clip of him. So there's a very complicated thing that plenty of you will know about called quantum computing. And Trudeau was asked at some conference, and it's all on video, about when he thought that a viable quantum computer was there, because he was sort of he was giving a big tech speech, and I think somebody just thought, I'll show him up by asking him this question. And Trudeau gave this enormously fluent answer about the range of times over which the necessary qubit, which is the sort of measure of how this will come about, might be realized. And it's a remarkably fluent and incredible answer. But I mean, basically, I think what I'm agreeing with Noran is that there aren't a great deal around it. And so if we can plug some of the work we're trying to do, is like, in terms of future leadership, in 20, 30 years time, it's just not going to be okay not to understand some of the stuff. I had to learn it. Noran's an expert. She's recently completed her PhD on it. I had to retrofit it all. I just think, in leadership roles in 25 years time, we're just going to have to understand it a lot better.
Noran, Kieran, thank you. This is just both of you so useful today. I hope that people listening have found it very practical as well. Everything from ransomware to phishing to, we finally found the justification. The university will be delighted that we've endorsed multi-factor authentication in this way. If anyone would like to now watch Mr. Robot, my Netflix password is Simkin123. Fill your boots, enjoy that, and enjoy Black Mirror on there as well. For now, I mean, really, thank you both so much. To combination of real expertise, but also the practical advice is exactly what we're looking for in this series. And so you've been very generous with your time and your wisdom and your advice. So a huge thank you. I know that both Noran and Kieran are also happy to take any follow-up questions that people have on Twitter too. So we'll make sure that we've got their handles in the links that we send out and below the YouTube video. But for now, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you for such a great set of questions. I'm sorry I only got to a fraction of the brilliant questions we had. Enjoy your evening, and a huge thanks to our two guests. See you soon.
Thank you.
This is where we hold our smiles for a while, looking like the Zoom has frozen. I just hope it doesn't make it onto the final video. If one of you could hack into the video afterwards and just remove all